The clerk slid the stamped receipt across the counter, and for a moment I just stared at it, unable to breathe. Years of scrimping, of working long nights while friends were out living their lives, had led to this single piece of paper. My mortgage gone. The house on Maplewood Lane was mine, free and clear. I pressed the paper flat against the counter as though I might absorb its weight through my fingertips. For the first time in my life, I felt steady, like the ground beneath me couldn't shift anymore. Driving home. I rehearsed how I might celebrate, maybe order takeout, maybe just open a bottle of the cheap wine I'd been saving for someday. It wasn't the kind of milestone that came with balloons or confetti. It was quiet, like me. That evening, I invited Sabine over, thinking even with all our history she might share in the relief of this moment. We sat at the kitchen table, the deed and final receipt still lying where I had placed them. She glanced at them once, then leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a smirk I knew too well. "Pack your bags," she said casually, as if she were suggesting a weekend trip. "My family's moving in. You don't need this much space all to yourself." The words landed harder than I expected. My stomach tightened. The air seemed to thin, and for a beat I couldn't speak. I had imagined she might envy me, even dismiss my achievement, but not this. Not a demand that turned my greatest victory into her possession. I folded the receipt carefully, tucking it into my purse, my mind already shifting from celebration to defense. And in that silence, I realized this fight was only beginning. Sabine's smirk stayed with me long after she left that night. It wasn't new. It was the same expression she had worn since we were children, the one that always came right before I lost something I loved. When we were little, Sabine had a way of bending the world around her. If she wanted the bigger slice of cake, she got it. If she wanted my new sweater, our mother would tell me to share. "She's older," Mom would say, as though that explained everything. I learned early that Sabine didn't ask, she claimed, and people let her. I used to believe our mother didn't see me, that her eyes were always trained on Sabine's needs. But on quiet nights, when Sabine was out with friends and the house finally stilled, Mom would sit on the edge of my bed. She'd smooth my hair and whisper, "You'll understand one day, Maribel. Independence is the only shield that lasts. Don't waste yourself trying to match your sister's shadow. Build your own light." At the time, those words felt like scraps comfort given because she couldn't stop Sabine from taking more. But after she passed, they became the compass I carried. Every late shift, every dollar saved, every morning I walked past the for sale sign that once stood in front of my house, I remembered her voice. Independence. A shield. And yet, as Sabine's smug command echoed through my kitchen, I felt like the same little girl again, standing small while my sister grabbed what wasn't hers. The mortgage was my shield, and I had thought it unbreakable, but Sabine had always been skilled at finding cracks. I went to bed that night replaying our mother's words, determined not to forget them, because if history was repeating itself, I would need every ounce of that shield to hold the line. I woke before sunrise, unable to push Sabine's words from my mind. As the first light slipped through the blinds, I wandered through the rooms of my house, touching the walls, the door frames, the furniture I had chosen piece by piece. It wasn't just a house. It was every year I had gone without to make sure it became mine. There had been nights when I lived on instant noodles so I could send one more payment. Birthdays passed with no celebrations. Holidays marked only by a candle lit alone in the kitchen. While friends bought new cars or took trips to the coast, I patched up my old sedan and kept working. I had told myself it was temporary, that the sacrifice would one day mean something. And now it did. I thought of the long weekends spent buried in spreadsheets, chasing promotions in an office where no one remembered my name. I thought of the loneliness, of saying no to dinners out, of sitting with the ache of silence because I couldn't afford to split my attention or my savings. Every sacrifice had a face, a memory, a cost. Standing in the living room, I pressed my palm flat against the wall. My mother's voice came back to me. "Build your own light." This house was that light. It had risen from all the pieces of myself I had given up along the way. It wasn't luxury. It was survival made solid. Brick and beam turned into proof that I could stand on my own. That was why Sabine's demand cut so deep. She hadn't been there for the long nights or the hollow days. She hadn't earned these walls, yet she looked at them as if they were hers for the taking. I knew then that letting her move in wasn't just about sharing space. It was about surrendering the very evidence that I had survived, and I wasn't ready to let that go. 2 days later, I came home from the grocery store to find a moving truck idling in my driveway. For a moment, I thought the driver was lost, until I saw Sabine's teenagers lugging boxes up my front steps, Paul directing them with a half-hearted wave like he was choreographing a dance. My chest went cold. I pulled into the garage and stepped out, bags still in my hands. "What is this?" I demanded. Sabine appeared in the doorway, sunglasses perched on her head, a box tucked under her arm. "What does it look like we're moving in? You have all this space." "Maribel, it's wasteful." I set the grocery bags down on the concrete, forcing myself to breathe. "This is my house. You don't just show up with a truck." Paul shrugged as he passed by, carrying a box labeled kitchen. "It's logical. You don't need a whole house to yourself. Families need homes." His tone was smug, as though reason itself was on his side. I followed them inside, my heart pounding as I watched Rowan and Celia push my books off the shelves to make room for their things. "Stop," I said, sharper than I intended. The kids glanced at me, smirked, and kept going. Sabine set her box down on the counter with a thud. "You always did cling to things. Mom would have wanted family under one roof. You should be grateful we're willing to share this place with you." The words stung. A familiar blade turned against me. I looked at the walls I'd sacrificed years to keep standing, now invaded by the noise of voices that treated it like a prize to be divided. My sanctuary was being stripped in front of me, brick by brick, box by box. But instead of shouting, I picked up my groceries and walked into the kitchen, every step deliberate. I could feel Sabine's eyes on me, waiting for a fight, but I wouldn't give her one, not yet. I placed the milk in the fridge, the bread on the counter, and let the silence settle like a blade between us. Because if she thought I was powerless, she hadn't seen what I could do when pressed against the wall. That evening, Sabine insisted we all sit down together for dinner, as though her arrival had somehow redefined the rules of my home. She'd already spread her things across the guest room, her children's belongings spilling into the hallway like weeds creeping through cracks. I cooked out of habit, though the sight of her family crowding around my table made every bite taste bitter. Halfway through the meal, Sabine raised her glass with a triumphant smile. "This house is meant for family," she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to make sure I understood what she meant. "It's too much for one person to keep to herself. We'll make it a real home." Paul nodded in agreement, and even the kids grinned, as if my silence was proof they'd already won. I set my fork down, the scrape against the plate louder than their laughter. My pulse thudded in my ears, but I kept my face calm. I leaned forward, my voice soft, almost tender, and whispered 4 words. "Check the deed tomorrow." The room stilled. For a moment, Sabine's eyes flickered, the certainty in them dimming. Then she laughed, sharp and dismissive. "You've always had a flair for dramatics, Maribel, but words don't change the truth." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I excused myself from the table, leaving their chatter to fill the space behind me. Upstairs, I locked my bedroom door, pulled out the folder where I kept every document that proved what was mine, and slipped it into my bag. The next morning, while Sabine was still asleep, I crossed the street to Mr. Keating's porch. He was already outside, reading the paper with his glasses low on his nose. When I told him what had happened, his expression hardened. "You've been patient long enough," he said. "It's time to remind them where they stand." By the time I walked back across the street, the weight of fear had shifted into something steadier. I wasn't going to scream or beg. I had the deed, the law, and my mother's words as armor. And tomorrow, Sabine would understand the difference between claiming something and owning it. The next morning broke heavy and gray, the kind of sky that pressed low over the street. I woke early, slipping downstairs before the rest of the house stirred. By the time Sabine's family began clattering in the kitchen, the paper was already pinned neatly to the front door, a formal warning drafted by Mr. Keating, citing my ownership in the unlawful occupation of my property. I heard Rowan's voice first. Mom, there's something on the door." His tone carried the nervousness of someone who didn't understand the weight of official letterhead. Chairs scraped, footsteps shuffled. Then came Sabine's sharp intake of breath. "What is this supposed to mean?" Her words were pitched higher than usual, as though she hadn't expected consequences. I stepped into the hallway, calm, coffee mug in hand. "It means you don't live here," I said evenly. Paul pulled the notice from the door, reading it aloud with a frown. Unlawful occupation, legal enforcement if ignored. His eyes darted to me. "You wouldn't actually go through with this, wouldn't I asked. The room hung in silence, broken only by the sound of Celia muttering, "This is embarrassing." By then, neighbors had noticed. Mrs. Whitaker from across the street slowed her morning walk, peering at the paper still taped in place. Another neighbor waved his phone, already snapping pictures. Gossip spread faster than the breeze. Sabine's face flushed a furious red. She tore the notice down, crumpled it, and slammed it on the counter. "You think this scares me?" she snapped. "You're just bluffing, Mary Bell." I held her gaze and took a slow sip of my coffee. Then keep testing it. The confidence she carried into my home days earlier began to crack. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in her posture, the way her hand trembled slightly as she gripped the countertop. Rowan and Celia retreated upstairs, whispering under their breath. Paul muttered about overreaction, though he didn't sound convinced, and Sabine stood there, her authority slipping like sand through her fingers. I turned and walked toward the kitchen window, watching the neighbors drift away, knowing word was already spreading. The balance in the house had shifted, and for once, it tilted toward me. By the end of the week, Sabine was already on the phone with anyone who would listen. I overheard her in the living room, voice dripping with righteous indignation. "She's trying to throw us out into the street." Her own sister. Can you imagine someone so heartless? The performance was convincing enough, but she underestimated how small towns worked. People remembered who signed checks, who held steady jobs, who stayed up late at their desks while others drifted from one failed venture to the next. My neighbors had seen me come and go for years, groceries balanced on one hip, laptop bag on the other. They knew exactly who had been paying the bills that kept this house standing. It didn't take long for whispers to circle back to me. Mrs. Whitaker, never one to keep gossip to herself, told me she'd heard Sabine crying to half the street about being betrayed. Then she lowered her voice and added, "But everyone knows better. You built this place, Maribel. People aren't blind." I thanked her, though inside I felt the sting of relief. For years, Sabine's words had cut deeper than truth, bending our family into her narrative. This time, the facts were too solid to twist. The deed had my name alone, and now the community knew it too. At dinner, Sabine tried again, launching into a speech about family unity and sacrifice, but her voice lacked its former confidence. Paul sat quietly, avoiding my eyes. The children pushed food around their plates, no longer so eager to jeer. The cracks had spread from the walls of the house into the fabric of her own family. I cleared the dishes in silence, letting her words hang unanswered. The power she once wielded so easily was slipping, and she knew it. Tomorrow, those cracks would widen. The notice should have been enough. Any reasonable person would have packed up and left. But Sabine thrived on defiance. By the second week, her boxes weren't stacked in corners anymore. They were unpacked, their contents spilling into my space as though they'd always belonged. I walked into the living room one morning to find my books swept aside, replaced by her framed family photos. Paul was on a ladder, hammering nails into my wall to hang their wedding portrait. "It'll look better here," he muttered, not even bothering to ask. Rowan had taken over my den, his video game console plugged into the outlet where I used to keep my work printer. Celia dragged her laundry basket into the hallway, leaving a trail of clothes that made my home feel like a dormitory. Through it all, Sabine held her head high, convinced she had already won. "See?" she said one evening, gesturing toward the rearranged rooms. "Doesn't it feel more alive now? A house needs family, not empty silence." I didn't argue. Instead, I pulled out my phone, snapped quiet pictures when they weren't looking, and tucked every change into a folder of evidence. Each click was a reminder that patience was its own form of resistance. At night, when they slept, I sat at the kitchen table reviewing the folder, my mother's voice echoing in memory. Independence is the only shield that lasts. I was building mine carefully, each document, each photo, another layer of armor. Sabine thought my silence was surrender. She mistook stillness for weakness. But all the while, I was preparing. The next step would not be a warning pinned to the door. It would be the strike that ended this battle once and for all. The papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the sheriff himself. His knock echoed through the house, cutting through Sabine's chatter like a blade. She opened the door, her smile faltering when she saw the uniform, and within minutes the truth lay in her shaking hands. The eviction was no longer a threat. It was an order. Paul cursed under his breath. Rowan and Celia stood frozen, and Sabine's voice climbed higher and higher, insisting there had been a mistake. The sheriff remained calm, firm. They had 72 hours to leave, and if they refused, the law would finish the work. The next days unraveled quickly. Sabine's confidence crumbled into frantic whispers, then into rage. She snapped at Paul, blaming him for not supporting her. He snapped back, accusing her of pushing too far. The children sulked in corners, embarrassed by the public spectacle. Neighbors slowed their cars, watching the shouting spill onto the porch. By the third day, the sheriff returned to enforce the order. Boxes were dragged back out to the driveway, but this time there was no smirk on Sabine's face. Paul refused to carry more than his share. Rowan stormed off after being scolded, and Celia cried openly, saying she hated all of it. I stood inside, steady while they packed. It wasn't triumph, I felt only the deep weight of an ending long overdue. When the last box left the threshold and the sheriff closed the door, silence settled over the rooms like a blessing. For the first time in weeks, the house was mine again, though its walls still echoed with the chaos they had brought. I leaned against the door, breathing in the quiet, already knowing what needed to come next. The morning after they left, I called a locksmith. The sharp click of new locks sliding into place felt like a line drawn across my life. No one would walk through that door again without my choosing. For the first time in weeks, I brewed coffee without the sound of voices invading the kitchen. The silence wasn't empty. It was mine. I spent the next days reclaiming every corner of the house. I pulled down the photos Sabine had hung, patched the holes Paul had left in the walls, and moved my books back onto their shelves. Each small act was a restoration, a reminder that the sacrifices I'd made hadn't been for nothing. I painted the guest room in a soft sage, not for anyone else, but because I liked it. When I finally stood back in the living room, breathing in the faint scent of new paint and lemon polish, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. My mother's words echoed softly. Independence is the only shield that lasts. She had been right. This house was never just brick and wood. It was the proof of my endurance, the vessel for my dignity. Owning it was one thing. Defending it, refusing to let it be taken, was another. And as I looked around at the space that once felt invaded, I saw it transformed not just a house, but a home that carried my name, my work, my truth. I sat by the window as the sun fell across the porch, knowing I had finally built more than walls. I had built the life my mother told me to claim, and no one would ever strip it from me again.